Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. What is the number one clue we all missed in the Murdaugh case? Now, it's not what is the biggest clue, it's the biggest clue that we overlooked, and there's a difference. Well, I think it's amazing that in both the Murdaugh and Idaho cases, there's very compelling audio evidence. That's not something you typically have in high-profile cases. Digital audio recordings, and obviously they are time-stamped in both cases. And although that matters, you're hearing something and you know what date it is and you know what time it is. And although I think these are very important clues, audio is difficult to scientifically prove. So that is not the number one clue we all missed. It's also not the number one clue that they can actually use in court in a very definite way. Now, in the JonBenet Ramsey case, did you know that there is audio of Burke Ramsey's voice, JonBenet's brother's voice, disputed, of course, but allegedly coming in after the 911 call saying, "What did you find?" And how that was supposed to have happened was that Patsy was in a rush to cradle the phone and she miscradled the phone, and so there was a period after she thought she'd hung up where you can hear also three voices: Patsy's, someone else's voice, and then someone else's voice. Well, who could that be? So this flies in the face of what everyone said about Burke Ramsey sleeping soundly through the night and until the next morning. But just as in the Ramsey case, although the disputed audio seems like a huge breakthrough, it seems like it changes everything, that's not always how a court of law sees it. So personally, when I listen to the dog video recording, I'm disappointed. That's my personal feeling about it. And what's quite interesting is you've got some witnesses who say, well, they're 100% sure that they are hearing Alex's voice. In the JonBenet Ramsey case, when you had people saying they are 100% sure that that is Patsy's handwriting, those people were dismissed because they said you cannot be 100% sure. And although that doesn't really apply, that only applies really to experts, you can kind of make the same sort of argument, not that the defense did. So in this case, it does sound like three voices, but there is very little to work with. And I don't think that recording helps Murdaugh very much. I don't think it helps him, but I don't think it's smoking gun evidence either. Ironically, the number one clue we all missed does have to do with smoking guns. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, I know I've been promising to do this deep dive down the rabbit hole. It just is quite an extensive subject, so I will try to do that ASAP. But we're first going to deal with the number one clue we all missed. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So what is the number one clue we all missed? What's the number one clue we all underestimated the value of? Well, let's have a listen.
That about a week after the murders, Mr. Alec Murdaugh's father had died, Mr. Randolph. And about a week after the murders, he shows up early in the morning at his parents' home, where his mother still is in late-stage Alzheimer's, on Alameda in Hampton. It's uncharacteristic for him to show up early, uncharacteristic for him to show up at all like that. And he comes in, and he's carrying something in a blue tarp, and he takes it upstairs, and eventually law enforcement finds out about that. And they go upstairs, and they find a wadded up, very, very large raincoat in a blue color. Could look like a tarp. And you're going to hear evidence that it was coated with gunshot residue on the inside.
And the other big piece of evidence that we heard about was a blue raincoat that Waters said that Alec Murdaugh, a week after the slayings, drove early in the morning to his parents' house and stashed in the upstairs there. That's something that we'd heard rumored before, but it had not been disclosed officially by state prosecutors. And what's interesting about that is that the raincoat apparently was coated in gunshot residue. And so we were told we would be hearing more about that later on in the case.
So far more compelling to me is both the absence of evidence in terms of Murdaugh's clothing, as well as the presence of gunpowder residue inside his vehicle and on the inside of his raincoat. The prosecutor mentioned this and stressed this during his opening arguments. In his opening, Crichton Waters said that gunshot residue was found on the seatbelt of Murdaugh's car, that's a Chevrolet Suburban, as well as on the inside of a raincoat discovered at his mother's home. The defense argued that the amount of this residue was inconsistent. And I think what they mean is that you'd expect a big cloud of this residue, and there was less than what they expected, right? And also in terms of a close range sort of shot, right? But I think if you think about the idea of taking a raincoat somewhere else, taking evidence somewhere else, isn't the idea that you're trying to minimize, reduce, get rid of evidence? And so why would you expect the residue to be consistent? Now, if I were investigating the MURDAUGH case, I'd want to know where the blue shirt, the khaki trousers, and the shoes are that Murdaugh was wearing in this image. Have they been found? Because one thing for weapons to disappear, it's quite another thing for clothing to disappear. Have they been able to find those clothes? I don't think the suspect was wearing the raincoat when he committed the crimes, or else the gunshot residue would be on the outside of the blue rain jacket. I believe he placed the clothing he wore inside the rain jacket to contain the evidence. The residue found on the seatbelt of his vehicle suggests a kind of relay where he drove somewhere wearing his original clothing and then inside the house stripped down, collected the clothing and then placed it inside the raincoat and perhaps carried it to the washer or some other disposal site. Whoever committed the crime seemed to think of everything except the gunpowder residue. Now, the other thing with gunpowder residue is that it's like a signature. No two rounds have the same signature, from different manufacturers, right? We learned this during the Rust shooting, that particular rounds from particular manufacturers leave behind a particular residue. No two rounds in terms of different ammunition, right? Different manufacturers have different residues, they have different signatures. Has there been any testimony that Alex or Paul did any shooting during the days or weeks prior to the actual shooting? Things were getting busy for Murdaugh that summer. And oddly enough, although his actual 54th birthday was on June 17th, did you guys know that? His birthday was actually 10 days after the murders. Murdaugh actually held a birthday party over the Memorial Day weekend. That is around about the 29th of May. In other words, a week prior to the murders. You kind of get the idea, wasn't that in order to have plausible deniability? Look at all of us happy together. In any event, why was it necessary to not only take a raincoat to his mother, but also stash it upstairs? It's where it was stashed and how it was stashed that's also important. So if certain things have been altered or hidden in this case, such as the weapon used to kill Paul, and I assume the clothing that the perpetrator wore, there are also a few things that were perhaps forgotten about, such as the ammunition that was lying around all over the place, right? And apparently that matched, the ammunition lying around the Murdaugh property matched that used to kill Maggie and Paul. Sled agent Jeff Croft, he was one of those called to the stand, and he held up a AR-15 style rifle and two 12-gauge shotguns recovered from Murdaugh's collection. I think the Daily Mail refers to it as a formidable gun collection. Well, it certainly is. And what you can see is how everything has its place. There's a certain racks for the weapons, and then there are also certain carry bags for certain weapons as well, all neatly stored in the gun room. There's a special room for that as well. And the guns are not alleged to have been used in the killings, these guns that were shown in court, because did you know that no murder weapons have ever been identified? But the types of ammunition discovered, right, the types of ammunition, the shells and rounds actually correspond to what was found. And then you say, well, what does that mean? Is that strong enough evidence? Did you know that MURDAUGH was actually holding a shotgun when the cops arrived? He was holding a Benelli 12 gauge shotgun when the cops arrived on the night of the murders. And he was saying that he did that to protect himself in case the shooter or shooters were still nearby. So I think then already he was suggesting shooters, right? I would imagine that was, if you tested that gun, that there would be no signs that it was actually used. In other words, wasn't that a display of plausible deniability? Well, look, here I've got a shotgun in my hand. Well, do you think I've used it? The ammunition contained in the rifle, the one that was used to kill Maggie, was Cellier and Belleau, .300 AAC BLK, the same type of ammunition used to kill Maggie. So what I think we need to know now is whether the residue type was the same as well. Was it the same residue from this type of ammunition? And this brings us to a very interesting point. If you acknowledge that the number one clue that we've all missed is the residue, and you take that whole argument further, and we know that there are two different weapons used to kill two people, well, then you're also talking about two different residue types. And so were two different residue types found inside the raincoat, or in the raincoat and on the seatbelt? Because if that is the case, they have found two different residue types, and only two different residue types, then that might be as close to smoking gun evidence as you're going to find in this case. The agent, Croft, also described finding 12 gauge ammo boxes at the home, including Federal and Winchester, the same brands as the two shells found near Paul's body. Now, the fact is you're going to get a different residue from Federal to Winchester. And so that's the ultimate test. Are they going to find the signature Federal and Winchester residues? Are they going to find that on that raincoat, or on the raincoat and on the safety belt? MURDAUGH seems to be implying the same thing the intruder did in the JonBenet Ramsey case. Someone or two someones came to commit murder, which was very deliberate, but forgot to bring a murder weapon. And so they just assumed they'd pick one up on the way. They'd pick one up at the property, and also that it would be loaded. And I guess they were willing and able to do this while MURDAUGH was at home, apparently sleeping in front of the TV. They would just pick up the guns that were lying there, even though someone was actually home at the time, and they would kill two people but not kill him, and not worry about him waking up, and not worrying really about him. It's a very lazy and unlikely explanation, but for it to have legs, the guns need to have legs. The guns need to disappear, and they have. MURDAUGH told cops that Paul, the youngest victim, had a tendency to sort of have his belongings strung out everywhere, including guns. That he would leave anything anywhere, and that it was not unusual for there to be guns out there. It sounds like he's saying it wasn't unusual for him to leave guns lying outside. His guns are worth quite a lot. And he said that to detectives just 3 days after the murders. And so what do you think he's suggesting there? He's suggesting that the murderers were wandering around and then just picked them up, right? The question is, was it unusual for him to leave guns out there? Because from where I'm looking, all the guns are neatly where they should be. There's a room and a closet dedicated to guns, and weren't housekeepers employed to keep things neat, to keep things from laying about? Maggie and the housekeeper would know the answer to this question, but they're no longer with us. They're no longer around to say any different. What about Buster? So I'm not going to take it further than that, but do look out for the journey down the rabbit hole where we'll review the timeline. I'm sorry it's taken this long to get to that, but I will do it in due course. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.